If this story touched you, leave a like and subscribe to follow more. Asterisk, I never thought my own blood would sell me out for 30 pieces of silver. But here I was, staring at the legal documents that proved everything I believed about family was a lie. The inheritance that should have been mine, the house my grandmother left specifically to me, was being contested by my own siblings. They claimed I manipulated her in her final years, that I was unfit to receive such a substantial gift. The irony wasn't lost on me that they were the ones manipulating the situation now. Asterisk, my grandmother Ruth had always been my anchor. When my parents divorced messily when I was 12, she took me in every summer and holiday. While my brother Marcus was busy with his football scholarships and my sister Alina was chasing her modeling dreams, I was the one who sat with Grandma Ruth through her chemo treatments. I was the one who learned her secret recipes, who listened to her stories about our family's history, who held her hand when she was scared in those sterile hospital rooms that smelled of disinfectant and broken dreams. Asterisk, for 15 years. I was her constant companion. I moved back to our hometown after college, specifically to be near her. I gave up job opportunities in bigger cities, turned down relationships that might have taken me away from her. My siblings called me foolish, said I was wasting my life, playing nursemaid to an old woman. They had their own lives to live, their own success stories to write. Marcus became a successful real estate developer. Alina married a wealthy banker. They visited on holidays, brought expensive gifts, took photos for their social media accounts, then disappeared back to their glamorous lives. Asterisk, but I stayed. I was there when she fell and broke her hip. I was there during the long nights when the pain medication made her hallucinate and she thought I was her deceased husband. I was there when she forgot my name but remembered that she loved me. And when she died peacefully in her sleep at 91, I was holding her hand, whispering that it was okay to let go, that I would be fine. Asterisk, the will reading was supposed to be a formality. Ruth had been clear about her intentions. She wanted me to have the house where I'd spent so many formative years, where I'd cared for her until the end. It was worth close to $800,000 in today's market. A beautiful Victorian in the historic district that had been in our family 4 generations. Marcus and Alina were to receive equal monetary distributions from her other assets, which amounted to roughly the same value each. Asterisk, but apparently, that wasn't enough for them. 3 days after the funeral, while I was still processing my grief, still smelling her lavender perfume in the hallways and finding her reading glasses in unexpected places, they blindsided me with a legal challenge. They claimed I had exercised undue influence over our grandmother, that I had isolated her from them, that I had manipulated a vulnerable elderly woman into changing her will in my favor. Asterisk, the accusations cut deeper than any physical wound, painted me as a predator, a manipulative vulture who had preyed on an old woman's loneliness and fear. They conveniently forgot that they were the ones who rarely called, who missed birthday dinners because of work commitments, who sent flowers instead of showing up when she was hospitalized. They forgot that I was the one who quit my marketing job to care for her full-time in her final year, living off my savings and the small stipend she insisted on giving me for groceries and utilities. Asterisk, their lawyer was expensive, ruthless, and thorough. He painted a picture of me as a failed adult who had latched onto my grandmother as a meal ticket, who had systematically turned her against her other grandchildren. He presented evidence that I had been living in the house rent-free, that I had access to her financial accounts, that I had been present when she updated her will. All true facts, but twisted into something sinister and calculating. Asterisk, my own lawyer, a kind but overworked public defender I could barely afford, advised me that these cases were difficult to win. The burden of proof was on my siblings, but juries often sided with multiple family members over a single beneficiary, especially when significant money was involved. The legal process could drag on for years, cost tens of thousands in fees, and there was no guarantee I would prevail. Even if I won, the victory might be hollow. The legal fees could force me to sell the house anyway. Asterisk, but what hurt most wasn't the legal maneuvering or the financial stress. It was the betrayal itself, the realization that the people I had shared holidays with, who I had called when I needed support, who I thought would understand the depth of my relationship with our grandmother, saw me only as an obstacle to their inheritance. They were willing to destroy my reputation, to drag our family's private pain into a public courtroom, to turn Ruth's final gift of love into a weapon against me. Asterisk, as I sat in that sterile conference room, listening to their lawyer describe me as a manipulative opportunist, I felt something inside me shift. The grief and hurt began crystallizing into something harder, more focused. They wanted to play games with money and manipulation. They thought they could outmaneuver me because I was the quiet one, the caregiver, the one who had always put family, harmony, above my own interests. They were about to learn that underestimating someone is the first step toward defeat. I looked across the table at Marcus and Alina, sitting there in their expensive suits, confident in their superior numbers and resources. They avoided eye contact, probably feeling some residual guilt about what they were doing, but not enough guilt to stop. Money, it seemed, had a way of drowning out conscience. They thought they knew me, thought they could predict my responses, based on 30 years of family dynamics. They were wrong. That night, I sat in Ruth's kitchen, my kitchen now, at least until the legal vultures picked it clean and formulated a plan that would have made my grandmother proud. She had always said that the best revenge was living well, but sometimes, living well required a little creative strategy. Ruth had been a chess player, and she'd taught me that the most powerful moves were often the ones your opponent never saw coming. I started by doing exactly what they expected me to do. I appeared to panic. I called Marcus the next morning, my voice shaking with what sounded like desperation but was actually carefully controlled excitement. I told him I couldn't afford a prolonged legal battle, that I was willing to negotiate a settlement. I could practically hear him smiling through the phone as he agreed to meet. The negotiation took place at Elena's house, a sprawling suburban mansion that screamed new money and insecurity. They had prepared their opening offer. I would receive $100,000 and walk away from any claim to the house or other contested assets. It was insulting, roughly 1/8 of what I was legally entitled to, but I pretended to consider it seriously. I asked for time to think, played the role of the grieving, overwhelmed granddaughter who just wanted the fighting to stop, while they waited for my response. I was busy implementing the real plan. You see, there was something my siblings didn't know about Ruth's estate. Something that would never appear in any will or legal document because it had nothing to do with official inheritance. Ruth had been a child of the Great Depression, a woman who had lived through rationing and uncertainty, who had learned early that banks could fail and governments could collapse, but tangible assets hidden in the right places could survive anything. Over the years, as I'd helped her organize her affairs and prepare for her passing, Ruth had shared her secrets with me, not just family recipes and old photographs, but the locations of her various hiding places throughout the house. She had been collecting coins, jewelry, and cash for decades, storing them in places that looked ordinary but were actually carefully constructed hiding spots. The false bottom in her jewelry box, the hollow space behind the loose brick in the basement wall, the waterproof container buried beneath the rose garden, the safety deposit box at a small community bank across town. Separate from her main accounts, Ruth had been paranoid about taxes and government overreach, convinced that official records were just ways for bureaucrats to track and confiscate what hardworking people had earned. So she had created a parallel financial world, one that existed in cash and precious metals and gems that could never be traced or taxed or contested in court. She had told me about it gradually, over months of casual conversations, swearing me to secrecy and making me promise that if anything happened to her, I would make sure these assets went to someone who truly understood their value. She had never specified exactly what that meant, but as I watched my siblings prepare to destroy me in court over assets they felt entitled to without having earned, I understood perfectly what she had intended. Ruth had known, even if she hadn't said it explicitly, that there might come a time when I would need resources that existed outside the legal system, assets that could give me power, and options that no lawyer or judge could take away. The total value of Ruth's hidden assets was staggering close to $600,000 in rare coins, gold jewelry, bearer bonds, and cash that had been accumulating interest in various forms for decades. More than enough to hire the best legal team money could buy, more than enough to drag out the court case until my siblings ran out of resources, more than enough to make their victory Pyrrhic, even if they eventually won. But I had no intention of using the money for legal fees. That would be playing their game by their rules. And I had learned enough from watching Ruth to know that the best players make their own rules. Instead, I was going to make them an offer they couldn't refuse, one that would give them exactly what they thought they wanted while ensuring they would regret it for the rest of their lives. I called Marcus and Alina and asked for another meeting. This time, I insisted it be at a neutral location, a conference room at the local library. Public enough that they would feel safe, but private enough for serious conversation. I arrived early, dressed in Ruth's pearl necklace and carrying a briefcase that had belonged to our grandfather. I wanted to project authority, to signal that something had changed since our last meeting. They arrived together, probably having strategized beforehand about how to handle my capitulation. Marcus was carrying a folder of paperwork, ready to close the deal and move on with his life. Elena looked slightly uncomfortable, her guilt apparently stronger than her greed, but not strong enough to stop her from attending the meeting that would finalize my financial destruction. I opened with a statement that surprised them. I was ready to make a counteroffer, not to accept their insulting lowball settlement, but to propose something different entirely. I told them I had found some additional assets that Ruth had left me, assets that weren't part of the official estate, and therefore weren't subject to their legal challenge. I was willing to use these assets to buy them out completely. The offer was simple. I would pay each of them $200,000 in cash, immediately, in exchange for them dropping their legal challenge and signing documents that confirmed my right to inherit the house and all other assets as Ruth had intended. It was more than they would receive from the official estate distribution. More than they could realistically expect to gain, even if they won their court case after paying legal fees. And it was available immediately, instead of after years of expensive litigation. Marcus was suspicious, of course. Where would I get that kind of money? I smiled and opened the briefcase, revealing neat stacks of $100 bills that I had withdrawn from various banks over the past week, converting Ruth's hidden assets into the most convincing form of persuasion possible. I explained that Ruth had left me some additional resources, personal gifts that were separate from the official estate, and that I was willing to use them to avoid a prolonged family conflict. Elena's eyes widened when she saw the cash. $400,000 in neat stacks. More money than she had probably ever seen in one place. I could practically watch her mental calculator working, comparing this immediate windfall to the uncertain outcome of a court battle that might drag on for years and cost them tens of thousands in legal fees with no guarantee of success. But Marcus was still skeptical. He wanted to know where the money had come from, whether it was legally mine to offer, whether there were any strings attached. I told him the truth, or at least the relevant parts of it. Ruth had given me some family heirlooms and collectibles over the years, and I had recently had them appraised and sold. The money was legitimately mine, completely separate from the contested estate, and I was offering it as a way to resolve our family dispute quickly and fairly. The beauty of the offer was its simplicity and immediate appeal. They could take the money and walk away with more than they had originally expected to inherit, or they could continue with an expensive legal battle that might leave them with less money and a permanently fractured family. The choice seemed obvious, and I could see the greed winning out over caution in their expressions. They took the deal, of course. Greed is such a predictable motivator, and my siblings had always been driven more by immediate gratification than long-term thinking. We met at Elena's lawyer's office the following Monday to sign the paperwork. I brought the cash in 2 separate briefcases, counted it out in front of them and their legal counsel, and watched their eyes light up with the kind of hunger that would have disgusted our grandmother. The documents were thorough and legally binding. They acknowledged that they had no claim to Ruth's house or any other assets in her estate. They confirmed that they were receiving these payments as a gift from me, not as part of any inheritance distribution. Most importantly, they agreed that this settlement was final and complete, that they waived any future claims related to Ruth's estate, and that they would never contest my inheritance again. Marcus signed first, barely reading the documents. In his eagerness to get his hands on the money, Elena hesitated slightly, perhaps sensing that something was too good to be true. But the sight of all that cash ultimately overcame her caution. They walked out of that office richer than they had been when they walked in, convinced they had somehow outsmarted their naive little sister who had let grief and desperation make her generous. If they had bothered to do any research, they might have discovered that the house they had just given up their claim to was worth significantly more than they realized. The historic district had been experiencing rapid gentrification, and similar properties had been selling for well over $1 million. But they had always seen it as just an old house in a small town, not understanding its true value or potential. More importantly, they had no idea about the extent of Ruth's hidden assets or my long-term plans for them. The $400,000 I had paid them was just the beginning of what Ruth had left me outside the official estate. There were still safety deposit boxes they didn't know about, investments in precious metals that had appreciated significantly over the years, and even some bearer bonds that Ruth had purchased decades ago as insurance against economic uncertainty. Asterisk. But the money wasn't really the point of my plan. The point was teaching them a lesson about the difference between value and price, about the cost of betraying family trust, and about the consequences of underestimating someone they thought they knew. They had seen me as weak and desperate, someone who could be bullied into accepting less than I deserved. They were about to learn how wrong they had been. Asterisk. The first phase of their education began about 3 months after our settlement. I started making improvements to the house, renovations that were long overdue but that I had been unable to afford while caring for Ruth. I hired contractors to restore the original hardwood floors, update the electrical and plumbing systems, and renovate the kitchen with period-appropriate fixtures that maintained the home's historic character, while adding modern functionality. Asterisk. The work took nearly a year to complete, and I documented every step of the process. I created a social media account dedicated to the restoration project, sharing before and after photos, discussing the historical significance of various architectural details, and celebrating each milestone in the house's transformation from a tired old building to a stunning example of Victorian craftsmanship. Asterisk. The posts began attracting attention from preservation societies, architectural enthusiasts, and real estate professionals who recognized the quality of the work and the rarity of finding such a well-maintained historic property. Comments poured in praising the restoration, asking about the house's history, and expressing amazement at the transformation. Several people mentioned that they would love to live in such a beautiful home, and a few even asked if I would ever consider selling. Asterisk. My siblings, who had apparently been monitoring my social media activity, began to see these posts and comments. At first, they probably felt smug about having gotten out before I spent a fortune on renovations that might not increase the property's value. But as the posts continued and the praise grew more effusive, I imagine they started to wonder if they had made the right decision. Asterisk. The doubt became certainty when a local real estate agent, impressed by the restoration work, reached out to ask if I would be interested in having the property professionally appraised for insurance purposes. She mentioned that she had been following the renovation on social media and believed the house might be worth significantly more than most people realized, given its historical significance and the quality of the restoration work. Asterisk. I agreed to the appraisal, partly because I was curious about the current value myself, but mostly because I knew the results would eventually make their way back to Marcus and Alina through the small-town gossip network that had been keeping tabs on our family drama. The appraisers spent nearly 4 hours measuring, photographing, and researching comparable sales in the area. When she delivered her report 2 weeks later, even I was surprised by the number. Asterisk. The house was now valued at $1.2 million. The combination of its historical significance, the high-quality restoration work, and the rapidly appreciating real estate market in the historic district had created a perfect storm of value appreciation. The property that Marcus and Elaine had been so eager to force me to sell for a quick payout was now worth more than twice what they had originally thought they were fighting over. Asterisk. But the financial revelation was just the beginning of their education. The real lesson came when I started receiving serious offers from buyers who had heard about the property through various channels. A young couple from the city who were looking for a weekend retreat, a retired professor who specialized in Victorian architecture and had been searching for the perfect restoration project, a small boutique hotel chain that was interested in converting historic properties into luxury bed and breakfast establishments. Asterisk. I turned down all the offers, of course. The house wasn't for sale, and it never would be. But I made sure to mention these conversations casually in family settings, during the few occasions when Marcus and Alina still made awkward attempts to maintain some semblance of normal family relationships. I would mention that another buyer had approached me, or that someone had commented on how much they loved what I had done with the place, or that a real estate professional had suggested the property might be worth even more than the recent appraisal. Asterisk. Each comment was like a small knife twist, a reminder of what they had given up in their haste to claim what they thought was rightfully theirs. They had traded a claim to $1 million property for $400,000 in cash, and the gap was only growing wider as the renovations continued and the property appreciated further. Asterisk. The psychological impact was exactly what I had hoped. Far. Marcus started making pointed comments about how well the renovations were going, fishing for information about my finances and hinting that maybe the family settlement had been too generous in my favor. Alina became increasingly uncomfortable during family gatherings, often changing the subject when anyone mentioned the house or asking pointed questions about my future plans. Asterisk, they were beginning to realize that they had been outmaneuvered. Not through any deception or legal maneuvering on my part, but through their own greed and impatience. They had taken a short-term gain instead of waiting to see the long-term value of what they were giving up. They had assumed I was desperate and foolish, and those assumptions had cost them hundreds of thousands of dollars. The most satisfying part of watching their growing realization wasn't the money, though. It was seeing them understand that I had never been the weak, desperate person they thought they were manipulating. Every interaction we had during the settlement process had been carefully calculated on my part. Every moment of apparent vulnerability had been a performance designed to make them overconfident and greedy. The cash I had offered them wasn't a panicked attempt to avoid litigation, it was a strategic investment in their greed, a way to get them to voluntarily give up claims that they might have successfully pursued in court. The immediate availability of so much money had short-circuited their ability to think clearly about the long-term implications of their decision. But even that wasn't the deepest level of my plan. The real masterstroke was what I did with the rest of Ruth's hidden assets, the money they never knew existed and therefore never realized they were missing out on, while they were spending their settlement money on luxury vacations and new cars. I was using the remaining assets to implement a plan that would ensure they never forgot the lesson I was teaching them. I established a family foundation in Ruth's name, dedicated to providing scholarships for students who were caring for elderly family members while pursuing their education. The foundation's initial endowment came from the assets Ruth had hidden throughout the house. Assets that totaled nearly $800,000 after I had paid my siblings their settlement money. The scholarship program was designed to help students who were in situations similar to what mine had been, young people who were sacrificing career opportunities and social lives to care for aging grandparents or other family members who were struggling to balance their educational goals with their family responsibilities. It was a way to honor Ruth's memory while helping others who understood the value of family loyalty and sacrifice. I made sure the foundation received significant publicity in the local media. The story was compelling. A young woman who had cared for her grandmother through a long illness, who had inherited not just property but also the values of family dedication, and who was now using her inheritance to help others in similar situations. The local newspaper ran a feature story about the foundation, complete with photos of me in front of Ruth's beautifully restored house and quotes about the importance of supporting caregivers. The article mentioned that the foundation had been established with a substantial endowment that would allow it to provide scholarships for years to come. It noted that I had chosen to honor my grandmother's memory not just by preserving the family home she had loved, but by creating a lasting legacy that would help other families facing similar challenges. Marcus and Alina read the article, of course. Everyone in our small town read it, and many people made a point of mentioning it to them. The story painted me as generous and forward-thinking, someone who had used her inheritance not for personal luxury but for the benefit of others. It implicitly contrasted my approach with their decision to cash out immediately for personal gain. But the real impact came when they realized the financial implications of what I had done. The foundation's endowment was nearly $800,000, money that had apparently materialized from nowhere. They began to understand that Ruth's estate had been much larger and more complex than they had realized, and that I had had access to assets they hadn't even known existed. The math was brutal when they finally understood it fully. I had paid them for $100,000 to give up their claims to an estate that included not just a house now worth over $1 million, but also hidden assets worth nearly twice that amount. They had received roughly 20 cents on the dollar for what should have been their inheritance, and they had voluntarily signed away their rights to everything else. Alina was the first to approach me directly. About 6 months after the foundation was announced, she came to the house one evening, ostensibly to see how the renovations were progressing, but really to try to understand what had happened and whether there was any way to undo their settlement agreement. I welcomed her warmly, gave her a tour of the restored rooms, and listened patiently as she worked up the courage to ask the questions that were obviously eating at her. Where had the foundation money come from? Had Ruth left other assets that weren't mentioned in the will? Was there any possibility that the settlement had been based on incomplete information? I answered her questions honestly but carefully. Ruth had indeed left me some personal items and family heirlooms that weren't part of the official estate. I had chosen to liquidate some of these assets to establish the foundation and make the house renovations. The settlement we had reached was based on the information available at the time, and was legally binding and complete. What I didn't say, but what Alina clearly understood, was that she and Marcus had been too eager to grab immediate cash to bother investigating whether there might be more to Ruth's estate than what appeared in the official will. They had assumed that what they could see was all there was, and that assumption had cost them more money than they would make in several years of their professional careers. Marcus took a different approach when he finally confronted me about the situation. He was angry rather than confused, convinced that I had somehow cheated them out of what was rightfully theirs. He accused me of hiding assets during the settlement negotiations, of manipulating them into accepting less than they deserved, of taking advantage of their desire to avoid a prolonged legal battle. I listened to his accusations calmly, then reminded him of the facts. Ruth had left me her house and personal effects in a legally valid will. He and Alina had chosen to challenge that will in court. I had offered them a generous settlement to avoid litigation, and they had accepted that settlement voluntarily after consulting with their own legal counsel. Everything I had done was completely legal and ethical. What Marcus couldn't accept was that he had been outsmarted by someone he had always seen as less successful and less sophisticated than himself. He had assumed that his business experience and Elena's connections would give them advantages in any family conflict. They had never considered that caring for an elderly relative for 15 years might have taught me things about patience, planning, and strategy that their corporate careers hadn't. The final phase of their education came when I made an announcement that surprised everyone, including myself. After 2 years of living alone in the restored house, surrounded by memories of Ruth and the satisfaction of having honored her memory appropriately, I decided it was time to move forward with my own life in a new way. I had been offered a position with a nonprofit organization in the state capital, managing programs that supported family caregivers across the region. It was work that aligned perfectly with my experience and values, and it offered opportunities for advancement that had never been available in our small town. The position came with a substantial salary increase and the chance to make a real difference in the lives of people facing situations similar to what I had experienced with Ruth. Taking the job would mean leaving the house, but I had always known that might happen eventually. Ruth had wanted me to have the security and options that the inheritance provided, not to be tied down by obligation to a particular place. The house had given me the time and space to heal from her loss, to process the betrayal by my siblings, and to plan my next steps carefully. I decided to turn the house into the headquarters for the Scholarship Foundation, converting the first floor into office space and meeting rooms while maintaining the second floor as a residence for visiting scholars and foundation staff. It would allow the house to continue serving a purpose that honored Ruth's memory while generating income that would support the foundation's work indefinitely. The renovation required additional investment, but the foundation's endowment had continued to grow through careful management and additional donations from people who supported its mission. Local contractors who had worked on the original restoration were eager to participate in the conversion project, and several businesses in town offered to donate materials and services. The project attracted even more media attention than the original renovations had. The story of transforming a family home into a foundation headquarters resonated with people who understood the challenges of caring for aging relatives. Applications for the scholarship program increased dramatically, and donations to the foundation grew as more people learned about its work. Marcus and Alina watched all of this unfold with growing frustration and regret. They could see that I had turned what they viewed as a simple inheritance dispute into something much larger and more meaningful. The money they had received in the settlement was long gone, spent on temporary pleasures and material possessions that provided no lasting satisfaction. Meanwhile, I had built something permanent and valuable, something that would continue generating benefits long after they had forgotten what they had purchased with their settlement money. But their real punishment wasn't financial, it was social and psychological. Our small town had followed the entire saga with interest, and the general consensus was that Marcus and Alina had been greedy and short-sighted while I had been generous and wise. People who had known our family for years could see the contrast between their approach and mine, and that contrast reflected poorly on their characters. They had expected to be seen as victims of my manipulation, but instead they were viewed as opportunists who had tried to cheat their sister out of her rightful inheritance. The foundation's success only reinforced that narrative, demonstrating that I had used my inheritance responsibly while they had grabbed what they could get and walked away. The social consequences extended beyond our hometown. Elena's marriage began to suffer as her husband realized that his wife had given up a claim to property worth over $1 million for a quick cash settlement. Marcus's business relationships were affected when potential partners learned about his family situation and drew their own conclusions about his judgment and character. Asterisk. They had thought they were playing a simple game of family politics and financial advantage, but they had actually been participating in a much more complex test of character and values. They had failed that test spectacularly, and the consequences would follow them for the rest of their lives. Asterisk. As for me, I had achieved something more valuable than money or property. I had honored Ruth's memory and values, supported causes she would have cared about, and demonstrated that her faith in me had been justified. I had also proved to myself that I was capable of strategic thinking and long-term planning, that I could hold my own in any conflict when the stakes were high enough. Asterisk. The house stood as a monument to family loyalty and perseverance. But it also served as a reminder that actions have consequences and that underestimating someone can be a costly mistake. Every scholarship recipient who walked through those doors would learn about Ruth's story and mine, about the importance of caring for family and the rewards that come from putting duty before personal gain. Asterisk. Marcus and Alina had wanted to teach me a lesson about power and money, about who really controlled our family's resources and relationships. Instead, they had learned a much more expensive lesson about the difference between short-term thinking and long-term wisdom, about the cost of betraying family trust, and about the danger of assuming that quiet people are weak people. Years have passed since that confrontation in the lawyer's office, and the foundation has grown beyond anything I could have imagined when I first established it. We've provided scholarships to over 200 students, funded research into caregiver support programs, and become a model for similar organizations across the country. The house that Marcus and Alina were so eager to force me to sell has become a symbol of what's possible when inheritance is viewed as an opportunity to serve others rather than simply a source of personal wealth. I've received awards for my work in the nonprofit sector, spoken at conferences about caregiver support, and even been featured in a national magazine article about innovative approaches to family philanthropy. None of that recognition would have been possible if I had accepted my siblings' settlement offer or allowed them to bully me out of what Ruth had intended for me to have. But perhaps the most satisfying aspect of how everything unfolded has been watching Marcus and Alina grapple with the long-term consequences of their choices. The $400,000 they received seemed like a fortune at the time, but it's been consumed by inflation, poor investment decisions, and lifestyle choices that reflected their short-term thinking. Meanwhile, the assets they gave up have continued to appreciate and generate value in ways they never anticipated. Elena's marriage did end in divorce, partly because of financial stress, but mostly because her husband lost respect for her judgment and character. She's struggled to rebuild her life and career, and she's never been able to shake the reputation she earned in our hometown as someone who had betrayed family loyalty for money. She's approached me several times over the years, sometimes directly asking if there's any way she could become involved with the foundation's work, other times hinting that she regrets how things unfolded between us. I've been polite but clear in my responses. The foundation is always open to volunteers who are genuinely committed to its mission. But it's not a way for her to ease her guilt or rehabilitate her reputation. If she wants to be involved, she needs to demonstrate the same kind of long-term commitment to serving others that Ruth valued and that the foundation represents. Marcus took a different path, doubling down on his business pursuits and trying to build wealth that would make his settlement money seem insignificant by comparison. He's had some success, but he's also had some spectacular failures. And his aggressive approach to business has earned him a reputation for being someone who can't be trusted to honor long-term commitments. His real estate development company has been involved in several controversial projects that have damaged relationships with local government officials and community leaders. He's never directly acknowledged that he made a mistake in how he handled Ruth's inheritance, but his behavior suggests that he's haunted by the lost opportunity. He's made several attempts to purchase historic properties similar to Ruth's house, apparently trying to recreate the success I've had with the restoration and conversion project. But he lacks the patience and vision that such projects require, and his attempts have generally failed or produced mediocre results. The most telling moment came 3 years ago, when Marcus approached me with a business proposition. He wanted to partner with the foundation on a project, That would involve purchasing and renovating historic properties for use as affordable housing for elderly residents. It was a reasonable idea that might have had merit, but it was also clearly his attempt to gain access to the foundation's resources and reputation for his own benefit. I listened to his presentation carefully, asked thoughtful questions, and then declined to pursue the partnership. I explained that the foundation's mission was focused on supporting family caregivers, not on real estate development, and that any expansion of our activities needed to align closely with Ruth's values and intentions. What I didn't say, but what Marcus clearly understood, was that I didn't trust his motivations or his ability to put the foundation's interests ahead of his own. That conversation was the last serious interaction we've had. We still see each other at occasional family gatherings, and we maintain the polite facade that family relationships sometimes require. But there's no real warmth or trust between us. He knows that I outmaneuvered him completely, and I know that he would do it again if he had the chance. The difference is that I'm no longer the naive, grief-stricken young woman he thought he could manipulate. Alina has been more successful at rebuilding some kind of relationship with me. Partly because her regret seems more genuine and partly because she's made real efforts to understand what the foundation represents and why it matters. She's volunteered at some of our events, donated money to our scholarship fund, and even referred several potential scholarship recipients to us. I appreciate those efforts, but I'm also careful not to give her more access or influence than she's earned through her actions. The truth is that what happened between us changed the fundamental nature of our family relationships in ways that can never be completely repaired. They proved that they were willing to betray me for money, and I proved that underestimating me was a costly mistake. We can be civil and even cooperative on certain issues, but the trust and affection that should exist between siblings has been permanently damaged. Sometimes, I wonder if Ruth would be proud of how I handled the situation. She valued family harmony, but she also believed in standing up for what was right and protecting what was important. I think she would approve of the foundation and the way I've used her gifts to help others. But she might be sad that her death led to such conflict between her grandchildren. On the other hand, Ruth was a practical woman who understood human nature better than most people. She probably anticipated that there would be some conflict over her estate, and she structured her gifts in a way that would test our characters and reveal our true priorities. The fact that I passed that test while Marcus and Alina failed, it might not have surprised her at all. Looking back on everything that happened, I've come to understand that the real inheritance Ruth left me wasn't money or property. It was the knowledge of who I really was and what I was capable of when pushed to my limits. Caring for her through her final years had taught me patience, resilience, and the ability to think strategically about long-term goals rather than immediate gratification. Those skills served me well when I needed to outmaneuver people who thought they knew me better than I knew myself. The foundation continues to grow and evolve, adapting to changing needs in the caregiver community while staying true to Ruth's core values of family loyalty and service to others. We've expanded our programs to include support groups for caregivers, respite care services, and advocacy for policy changes that would better support families dealing with elder care challenges. Each new program represents another way that Ruth's legacy continues to make a positive difference in the world. I've also found personal fulfillment in ways I never expected. My work with the foundation led to relationships with other professionals in the nonprofit sector, including someone who became much more than a colleague. David manages a foundation that supports veterans with disabilities, and we met at a conference about innovative approaches to charitable giving. He understands the demands of foundation work and the satisfaction that comes from helping others in meaningful ways. Our relationship developed slowly, built on shared values and mutual respect rather than the kind of superficial attraction that had characterized my earlier relationships. David had also cared for an aging parent, so he understood the sacrifices I had made for Ruth and why they had been important to me. When I told him about the conflict with my siblings, he didn't see it as family drama but as a test of character that had revealed everyone's true priorities. We married 2 years ago in a small ceremony held in the garden behind the foundation headquarters. Ruth would have loved the setting, surrounded by the roses she had planted decades earlier and overlooking the historic district she had called home for most of her life. Marcus and Alina attended the wedding, but their presence felt more like an obligation than a celebration. They were polite and appropriate, but it was clear that they still saw me as someone who had somehow cheated them out of what they deserved. David and I live in the city now, in a modern apartment that's the Complete opposite of Ruth's Victorian house, but that suits our lifestyle and work demands. We visit the foundation regularly, and I maintain an office there for the days when I work remotely. But I'm no longer tied to the house in the way I was during the years immediately following Ruth's death. The house itself has become something beyond what I originally envisioned. The first floor offices are busy with staff and volunteers managing scholarship applications, organizing caregiver support groups, and developing new programs. The second floor residence hosts visiting researchers, guest speakers, and scholarship recipients who come to learn about the foundation's work. It's a living memorial to Ruth that serves the community in ways she would have found deeply satisfying. But perhaps the most meaningful aspect of how the house is being used is the archive we've created in Ruth's former bedroom. We've collected oral histories from elderly residents throughout the region, preserving their stories and experiences for future generations. Many of these people are similar to Ruth's children of the Depression who lived through tremendous social and economic changes, who built families and communities through their own hard work and determination. The archive has become a resource for local historians, genealogy researchers, and students studying regional history. It's also a place where family caregivers can come to understand that they're part of a long tradition of people who have made sacrifices to care for their elders. The stories we've preserved demonstrate that what I did for Ruth, and what our scholarship recipients are doing for their own family members, is part of a pattern of love and duty that has always been central to human experience. Marcus and Alina have never visited the archive, despite invitations to contribute their own memories of Ruth and our family history. I think it would be too painful for them to confront the evidence of what they lost when they chose immediate financial gain over long-term family legacy. The archive represents the kind of generational thinking that Ruth valued and that they abandoned when they challenged her will. Sometimes visitors to the foundation ask about the family conflict that led to its creation. I usually give a brief, factual account without dwelling on the emotional aspects of what happened. I explained that my siblings and I had different ideas about how to honor Ruth's memory, and that I chose to use my inheritance to create something that would serve others rather than just benefit myself. What I don't usually share is how the experience changed my understanding of family relationships and human nature. I learned that people can surprise you in both positive and negative ways, that greed can overwhelm even strong family bonds, and that sometimes the people who seem weakest are actually the most dangerous when they're pushed too far. I also learned that revenge doesn't have to be destructive or vindictive. The most effective revenge is often simply living well, achieving success, and demonstrating through your actions that those who underestimated you were wrong. Marcus and Alina wanted to teach me that I was powerless and naive, but instead they provided me with the motivation to prove my strength and wisdom. The foundation's success is the best possible response to their betrayal. Every scholarship we award, every caregiver we support, every program we develop serves as evidence that I used Ruth's gifts wisely while they squandered their opportunities. The contrast between our approaches speaks louder than any argument or confrontation ever could.